A subscriber, Vanessa Jakes or Vanessa Jacques, asked me this question, and I thought it was an interesting one and definitely worth following up. It came out of an earlier video I'd made where someone had told me that China should be grateful to the US. One of the major but less obvious reasons why China should not be grateful will be explained here. The question was a simple one. Why did Japan invade China? Wherever you are, welcome to another edition of My Take on China, and this one has some obvious answers. It also has some more complex reasons behind it. Now, of course, I know there will be many of you who can add further context. Please don't think I'm being flippant when I try and fit this into less than 10 minutes of a video. Of course, there will be some context missing and there will be some nuance, but please feel free to add these in the comments. Just don't jump on me when you think that maybe I've left something out which is really important and ought to be considered. There are many contentious issues, and I've tried to verify all of my facts through different sources, including Japanese history, which, as may be expected, is a lot different to China's written history on the period. And this could be the topic of a book on its own. Probably it already is, but for today, let's keep it simple and cover the obvious and apparent reasons. There were several of them. One was clearly because Japan was a recently industrialized nation with few resources, and that's a situation that still exists and might explain why they are so subservient to the US today. And China was close by. It was also backward, weakened, and corrupt. At the time, it also had an abundance of resources. There was already overcrowding and unsustainable population growth in Japan, so the Korean Peninsula and northeast China were attractive to them, as those places had a lot more space, they had arable land, and they were relatively indefensible because of weak military in both countries. China's island province of Taiwan was also an easy target, and other than a few islands, probably the first expansion of the Imperial Japanese Army as a colony, which took control of the island and created that Japanese colony shortly after the signing of the Shimonoseki Agreement. I've read that it took 2 years to finally get control from the Chinese inhabitants on the island, who put up pretty strong resistance. Even then, it seems China didn't want to give up Taiwan, and nothing has changed. Japan had a lot of trade with Korea in this period, around the 1890s, which provided much agricultural product, but coal, oil, iron, and rubber needed to be imported in large amounts as Japanese industry grew. China had much of that, and Southern Asia had more. Rubber and coal were found in abundance in the south, and much of the oil that was needed was provided by Britain through Burma, and I'm guessing here probably Malaya or Malaysia as it is now too. But I'm not sure, as oil was only discovered there by Shell in 1891 and was a small producer for a while. But there was oil going into Japan at the time that Japan needed it, and it was mostly from British and some American sources. China had effective control over the Korean Peninsula, and Japan didn't like that. Apparently, Korea were okay with it, but we can never be certain that their official documentation reflects the real position of the people. But on paper, it does appear at least that Korea were happy being a dependency, perhaps even a protectorate of China. Russia was a huge and growing worry to the West. Communism was looming at that time, but had not taken over. This was before the first Russian Revolution, which happened in 1905. But the indicators were already there. The Bolsheviks were rising. However, the Russian government of the time were in a triple intervention with France and Germany, and once Japan had invaded and taken over the Liaodong region, those three nations forced Japan to hand it over to them for a fee, meaning that at that time, parts of China were being handed around and traded between forces other than Chinese. This was well into the century of humiliation, which had started with the Opium Wars and the loss of Hong Kong, among other things. Now, the West, particularly the USA, wanted to hold that Russian, German, and French triple intervention in check. So it suited them to assist Japan with militarization in the east in order to contain Russia to Japan's north. Now, we've all probably seen, or at least heard of, the movie The Last Samurai, where the US helped Japan's military to adapt from a medieval system to a modern, well-drilled, well-trained, well-equipped military. That story is based on a true story, albeit embellished for Hollywood. Western imperialism had reached Japan in the 1850s and was not welcomed. The US forced Japan to open up, and the people didn't like it. It was also the end of the shoguns and the beginning of the Meiji Restoration, a period of enlightenment, maybe the first American color revolution. All the factors aligned to create a significant period of change, and the emperor was reappointed and created the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy, responsible only to him, not the government. Even the Prime Minister didn't get a say in this, so decisions were not taken with any degree of democracy at all. There was a declared war against China, the first Sino-Japanese War, which started in 1894 and ended with the Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895. Gunships and oil were provided by Britain. Military training was provided by the USA to the Meiji. Clearly not something Chinese ought to be thanking the USA for. And remember, China was not aggressive. They were being invaded. So this is another addition to the reasons I gave why China has nothing to be grateful for. Squabbling over this region caused the Japanese to sign a military agreement with Britain. They entered a war with Russia, which is presumably what US and Britain wanted all along. And this was called the 1904-1905 Sino-Russian War. And that was because the Russians wanted a Chinese port called Port Arthur, which is not in Australia or any other British colony. It's actually in the Chinese city of Dalian and is correctly known as Lushun. After Japan won a long and very costly battle for this port, including the deaths of up to 56,000 Japanese troops, with no idea how many Chinese died, the US arranged a treaty to end that war. President Roosevelt got the Nobel Peace Prize for arranging what became known as the Treaty of Portsmouth, which allowed Russia to keep Vladivostok but gave Lushun in Dalian as well as all of the Korean peninsula to the Japanese. And here's the worst part of it. The Koreans and Chinese weren't even involved in this. Russia and Japan, with UK and US support, were squabbling over parts of China and the entire Korean peninsula, and no one thought to ask the people who lived there whether they wanted any say in who got control. Now, what a lot of people don't realize is that Japan and Russia are very near neighbors. There's only a 3-kilometer stretch of water between the last of Japan's islands and the first Russian island. The US and Britain knew this and played them off against each other. China was very much the loser in this geopolitical game. So, further evidence, China has very little to be grateful to the US for, as the US continued to train, supply and equip the Japanese military, including having Japan as their ally against Germany in World War I. So, most people think that Japan invaded China in 1937. The truth is, the invasion was able to be so successful because they had control of a deep water port for 30 years before. During the intervening years, they built a network of roads and rail to allow them swift access into the northeast Dong Bay of China in 1937. And they expanded what they'd already taken. Why they did what they did after the invasion is another story, which has already been told more horrifically and more sensitively than I could ever tell it, but it is a horror story. Thanks once again for watching my take on China, and now you know why Japan invaded. It wasn't just because Japan wanted to, it was because the US and Britain wanted to take Russia out of China. There you have it. Now you know. See you next time.